In March, Sinclair Broadcasting, the largest owner of local television stations around the country, launched Project Baltimore, a special investigative team to focus solely on the Baltimore City schools. According to Sinclair, Project Baltimore's task is to save a struggling school system.
How to fix Baltimore City's struggling school system has been a divisive issue in our state for years.
To Project Baltimore's recent investigations into allegations of grade change.
Sinclair is known for its deep ties to far right-wing causes and organizations. John Oliver produced a scathing video on the company's right-wing agenda.
But Sinclair can sometimes dictate the content of your local newscast as well. And in contrast to Fox News, a clearly conservative outlet where you basically know what you're getting, with Sinclair, they are injecting Fox-worthy content into the mouths of your local news anchors.
Did the FBI have a personal vendetta in pursuing the Russia investigation of President Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn?
Did the FBI have a personal vendetta
in pursuing the Russia investigation of
President Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn?
On Thursday, the FCC recommended a $13 million fine for Sinclair for failing to disclose it was airing paid programming, the largest such fine the commission has ever recommended. This comes just weeks after the FCC changed local media ownership rules, paving the way for Sinclair Broadcasting to buy Tribune Media for $3.9 billion. Sinclair will be broadcast to nearly 3/4 of households nationwide. Even members of the Baltimore City Council have concerns about Project Baltimore.
They have a clear agenda, which is a negative one, to paint our school system in a bad light, to paint our young people in a bad light.
This prompted us to take a closer look at Project Baltimore in light of Sinclair's political agenda. Project Baltimore declined to comment for the story, but Sinclair's Vice President of News, Scott Livingston, denied that Sinclair has influence over Project Baltimore, saying their stories come from their viewers, adding that we have the responsibility to discover the truth and empower students and parents, Livingston said. Since we too are a media organization that reports on city schools, we approach this question carefully. Our goal was to not simply critique their work, but to explore how their stories portray the complex topic of education. And are these stories serving a public that looks to the media for insight and understanding? After we recorded the following panel discussion, Project Baltimore filed suit against the Baltimore City school system for denying a request for information about an investigation into alleged grade changing at a Northeast Baltimore charter school. The school system vowed to fight the request in court, saying the release would violate employee privacy rights and would not serve the public interest. They also made their first public statement about Project Baltimore, saying they claim to champion accountability, but instead pursue sensationalism. Diamond Tay Brown is a Baltimore public school teacher and activist. Chris Burnett is a Baltimore City Council person from the 8th District. Shaheen McLaurin is a youth advocate and executive director of Baltimore Start Project. Lawrence Grand Prix is director of research at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Let's just start with this simple question. You've all taken a look at some of Project Baltimore's stories. Project Baltimore says, they want to save the public schools. Diamond Tay, you're a public school teacher. You work in the schools every day. You've seen these stories. You've seen Project Baltimore. Let's start with you. What do you make of what they're doing?
Well, like we spoke about this earlier, Jessel. At first, I was on the bandwagon. At first, I was like, oh yeah, we need to expose these issues that are going on. And then I had a moment of reflection, and then I realized, I said, wait, they're building a case to privatize schools, because I started to notice that there was a pattern that they would expose any negative information, but there was never a follow-up to solutions. What was the root cause of the problem or anything like that? So I definitely think that I don't think they have the best intentions, and I wonder if they understand what the unintended consequences will be of their actions.
So Shaheen, I want to turn to you. You graduated from the Baltimore school system not too long ago. Now you're a college graduate. You run your own nonprofit. You work to elevate Baltimore youth. Talk about what your own experiences was, the experience of your friends and your family in Baltimore schools. Do they need a radical change, and what kind of change should that look like?
So Oddly enough, my middle school that I went to, William C. March Middle School, was shut down too. That was kind of private. The March Funeral Home paid for that, the name for the school. And then my high school, Friendship Academy, which was a charter school, a public charter, was shut down as well. And my experiences in these schools pretty much just proved to everything that I learned after reading a few of these stories, that there's not too much of a difference between charter schools, privatized schools, and the public school system. I felt let down a lot. My family felt let down a lot. I've seen a lot of fellow students around me succumb to a lot of issues because of the dreams that they sold us in these schools that were not necessarily true.
What do you mean by that?
So my school was a science and technology school, yet I barely ever saw a science or technology class in my school. We pretty much, we just did the same thing that a lot of other people did, but the name was just tacked onto it. I don't think I was prepared for life after graduating school. When I went to college, I was very far behind my peers, and it took me a long time to catch up. And going to a school like that, they would pretty much say that they would prepare you for life like that, but they didn't. So,
wanted to get your thoughts, Lawrence.
So I think it's an interesting conundrum where, as your viewers probably know, Sinclair Broadcasting is owned by a noted conservative. So the stories and how they report about Baltimore can be seen as reflecting a conservative view. But I do think what's happening here isn't just a left-right political thing, it's a larger societal thing about how we think about the capabilities of public school students and black students from public schools. So they're using a lot of very simplistic stats that feel true, but really are totally out of context. So if you look at Baltimore's, they say it's the 4th highest per pupil funding. And as you point out, they are using certain metrics for large urban school districts. They're all underfunded. So it'd be more accurate to say Baltimore is the 4th least underfunded large urban school district. So these fundamental systemic issues of white flight and tax bases, and let's not even talk about Baltimore's being majority black, the legacy of racism, white supremacy, it's all glossed over. But I don't think it's just conservatives that this applies to. There's a larger societal issue about how do we see what's happening in public schools as a reflection of the inability for us to take a larger systemic view about how we got here. And instead of saying we aren't happy with where the schools are, I don't think anyone is. So I look at these stories and say kind of duh. And the big question, as Ms. Brown points out, how are we going to move forward in a way that achieves what we all claim to want, which is a better education for our children, and by not providing a narrative that actually explains some of the progresses that African-centered education has produced, that black homeschool cooperatives have produced, that puts agency in the black community, that says the black community can educate itself and save itself, you presuppose you need a white savior to come in, or heaven forbid, you need Pitbull to come in.
I think Baltimore is one of the cities that needs slam the most. It's obviously you see that they're going through a lot and have been through a lot in Baltimore.
To save black kids in Baltimore. And these are the somewhat subtle, tacit assumptions we make about black school kids that aren't just conservative or liberal, but there's a larger societal issue at play here.
And that brings up a good point. I was just, I recently interviewed the Associate Dean of Education at Loyola University. And, to put this all in context, right, until 70 years ago, Baltimore had one black high school. After white flight, the black schools were completely defunded. It took years of lawsuits to actually get funding for the school system, and they were still forgotten. But now that Baltimore City is people want to move back here now people are asking this question: how do we save these schools? So that context is really important. Christopher Burnett, councilperson, we heard you earlier talking about your thoughts on Project Baltimore. Feeding off Lawrence, what actual solutions are you hearing from the community, and what their reactions are to Project Baltimore?
So it's been very difficult because people in my district they consume the media. you know, and not really knowing that it's slanted or not really, I think we have a natural inclination that we trust the media. We think that any statistic they will put out would be vetted and be true. And they know from the reality, right? They send their children to public schools, or they attended public schools themselves in Baltimore City. And so we do know the realities of our school system, and we have a lot of challenges. Our kids are not graduating and ready to compete in a global society, if graduating at all. I mean, we know the statistics pretty well. But I think the problem is that there's a lot of really good stuff happening in city schools that we do not focus on at all. I mean, there's kids winning. We talked earlier a little offline about kids doing very well in debate, robotics, the sciences. There's a lot of great stuff happening at schools in my district. Edmonton High School, there was a story about a graduate who's now opened her third hair salon, coming through the cosmetology program. And so those are the things that do not get focused on, which is problematic, and that, like, one, the news should be unbiased. It should not have a political slant, whether it's conservative or progressive or Democrat or Republican. It should be about reporting the facts. And so I think we got to recontrol the narrative, but also hopefully, I guess if there's something that could come out of this is that we mobilize our parents and advocates around these issues, because underfunding is a challenge. Now it's about changing the messaging, right? Because the focus on funding is always around, well, what are they doing at North Avenue? What is the school headquarters doing? The teachers are being paid too much money and not producing the results. We need to cut teacher salaries. We need to close buildings. And this is how you kind of create that fertile ground for privatization, is by pretty much trying to destabilize the environment. So I think part of it's mobilizing people around the real issues, that our schools are actually underfunded, that our teachers do not have everything that they need to prepare our children to be successful. We do not have enough technology. Some of our buildings do not have running water. I mean, there are real issues in the city school system, and we need to mobilize people to change the funding formula, to account for things like concentrated poverty, or students that do not speak English as their first language or may have learning disabilities. I mean, the calls I get are always around, we're spending too much money on the school system, and my pushback is we're not spending enough, right? The money that we invest in our schools will produce the results that we need, and if we are underfunded by the tune of over $1 billion and over a 10-year period, then we're going to continue to struggle.
I wanted to play a recent story that Project Baltimore did about this question over school funding. Here's that clip.
Rotary now favors a new funding formula, spearheaded by the Kirwan Commission, tasked to recommend changes in how Maryland funds public education. The idea? To inject more tax dollars into poorer districts like Baltimore City, in part by adjusting for those developer tax breaks. But some say more money will not matter. Project Baltimore compared state funding to test scores in Baltimore City schools. Here's what we found. From 2007 to 2014, the state, under the Thornton funding plan, increased funding to Baltimore City schools by $170 million. That is an increase of 22%. Now, in that same time period between elementary and middle school students, English test scores rose by just 9%. But math scores for the same students tanked by 13%. Did the Thornton plan work?
The answer is emphatically no. It did not work.
Will Kirwan work?
Regardless of how much money we throw at the system, it's not moving a needle with regards to test scores.
There was a few points raised there. The first thing that, the point was made that from a right-wing think tank that more money is not going to have more results. Now, everything we've already talked about, you've experienced, is that the schools don't have enough resources. And that's what the state has found, that the schools are underfunded by 20%. How do you respond to someone at a DC think tank or a Maryland think tank saying that more money is not going to make educational outcomes better in Baltimore?
Well, I would respond first by saying that their idea of what success is skewed in the first place, because test scores can't be the main determinant for success. And the reason being is that, one, Baltimore City Public School students, at least my students, they don't take the test seriously because they know it's not a good measurement of their academic achievement. And they rebel against the test. So what they do is they just skip through questions, or they dip out. Dip out means they leave. Or they don't come to school that day. And so it needs to. If we're going to use tests as the main determinant for success, there has to be a culture shift where we teach our kids how to play the game. And I have these conversations in my classroom. Look, I know the tests don't mean anything to you guys, but these people on the outside, they're judging you based on this test score. So let's play the game. But those conversations aren't being had. There's two conversations being had. One is tell the kids you don't have to worry about that test because that's not how they should be measuring our intelligence anyway. The other is you got to do the test, so do it, right? But there's not that middle ground that's saying, guys, we know this isn't a good tool. However, this is how we get money. This is how blah, blah, blah. This is how these things happen. And so I bring that all the way back to say that, you know, so if you're saying the money is just to increase test scores, then no, it's not going to work because our kids already got that game. They already know the game. They don't want to play it. You know, so we have to reevaluate. We don't need to reevaluate because I think that my people, I know how to determine our success. But the issue is that other people are putting their perspective on what success means and what academic achievement is, and I think that's where the issue begins.
And by the state's own calculation, your school is underfunded by more than $3,000 per student.
Yes.
What could your school do with that money?
Well, I could have full sets of books. So I teach for Upward Bound as well on Saturdays, and I teach students that actually come on Saturdays with books that they have from their school. So for example, my kids are reading Between the World and Me and a Beautiful Struggle, and I don't have enough books. I have enough books for them to read in the classroom, but I can't send them home because if I send them home and one doesn't come back, now I don't have enough for the classroom. So where other kids have the opportunity to reflect on what we read in class, to go further, to do all of these things, my kids don't, because we don't have something as simple as enough books for an entire class of students.
Lawrence, I want to get your response to that. The clip you just heard talking about test scores as the ultimate factor, reflection of how a student's doing, and the idea that the schools are getting funded enough and they don't need more funding.
I've already kind of talked about why I feel that the argument around funding is basically specious at best. So they're using statistical tricks around how they're talking about test scores. So they said in one clip from Sinclair Media that there were all these high schools where 0 students were proficient.
Baltimore City's 39 high schools, 13 had 0 students proficient in math.
So the question is, what's the test and how do you measure proficient? If proficient is the median, like the national median, all you've really said is that poor black kids in Baltimore City don't score as well as middle-class white kids, to which I say, duh. Right, but it sounds terrible. It sounds like we've failed these kids tremendously. And then you have to ask the question, as was previously brought up, how are we using test scores to define success? I've never been in a professional environment where they say, well, we want you to code for us, but can you line this sonnet first? Or we want you to help us with our social media, but we need you to give us the quadratic equation real quick. It's simply not relevant to a global economy that, while focused on information, is not focused on the types of information, the type of skills that produce good test takers. So we have an entire culture of seeing a good student essentially as a good test taker. While even the goal that we lay out, which is preparing kids for future life, it's not test-taking skills necessarily that lead one to be a good employee. It's critical thinking. It's being able to take from different schools of thought and mix and match. We're in an increasingly a mix and match world. And test-taking is actually the wrong way of thinking for many of the growing jobs of the future. So my think tank is not a left or a right think tank. We're a community-based think tank. And so we are looking at the types of things that folks could do with that money that would actually improve kids' performance. And while I would like to think every teacher in Baltimore would buy more copies of Ta-Nehisi Coates, I do think we need to have a conversation that says that if we define test taking as the metric, putting more money into the schools so we can try even harder to make these kids better test takers, that's a failed mission. Mm-hmm. And we've actually done the kids a disservice if we don't have the accountability and reflexivity to say, yes, you need more money, but also no, the goal of that money is not just to make them better test takers. Mm-hmm. It is to give them the critical thinking skills and the agency they need to be able to live in the world effectively.
Yeah, and it was a No Child Left Behind Act, which was supported by Democrats and Republicans. It really started this age of high-stakes testing and accountability, and growing number of experts, even former supporters of these policies, are saying, I've reached the conclusion that you have, that, and I think, Shaheem, I want to get your thoughts on this. Do test scores help you prepare for your life after school? Talk about that.
Absolutely not. Honestly, my test scores, speaking from my own personal experience, were horrible. And I got the best in my school, but they were still horrible compared to the national average. And I would like to think that I am a bright person. I still was able to go to school and outperform people in classes where it called for it, things that I was passionate about, things that I cared about, like my community, like history, like everything else. Like I don't think test scores even mean much of anything to a student's predictability of whether or not they'll have a good future, whether or not they could be productive, whether or not they could exceed at any challenge that you throw their way. I just think that a test score is a test score. And I agree with what you said, that it's a game. And honestly, the whole entire education system is reinforced by racist ideals that have been in this country for a very, very long time, and it does nothing but perpetuate cycles that hold certain demographics of people in this country down. And I do believe that focusing on test scores when it comes to this money is pretty ridiculous and pointless, but I do believe that there needs to be a huge investment in our schools. Like my schools, we didn't even have proper technology. There are people who I met later on in life that have had laptop carts with iPads and stuff like that in their school. We didn't even have updated textbooks, and that's a huge problem. To expect us to know things without teaching us even from updated material is just absolutely ridiculous. A lot of students are set up for failure before they even get to start.
And it's interesting because if you compare schools in Baltimore City and schools in Baltimore County, they have similar levels of funding. Baltimore City gets a little more, but they have iPads in middle schools. They have access to this technology, and the reason for that is because Baltimore County doesn't have the concentration of poverty that exists in Baltimore. And often what's not said in these discussions is that that is a result of deliberate public policy to create poverty, to redline communities, to prevent the creation of wealth in Baltimore City, when it was encouraged and subsidized in the counties like Baltimore County and other counties. But Shaheem and Chris, you were both at this recent March for Youth funding. LBS was there too. Do schools have enough money in the city?
So to jump in a little bit on that, so even in the county, because of their population, is able to contribute more to their individual school system. So while we may have similar funding levels from the state, what that actual jurisdiction is able to contribute to its own school system is completely different. And when you talk about what parents of those students in wealthy parts of the county are able to provide for their kids, whether it's after-school tutoring, their own home technology, iPads, and other just access to technology to reinforce what they're learning, it does move the needle a little bit more, dramatically more than what a lot of our parents are able to contribute or to participate in our kids' lives. And I think it even goes into other issues that kind of spill into this. I mean, the debate around the minimum wage here in Baltimore, one of the points that I was pushing for was that, we can say that people should go back to school and make more money and make better of themselves, but if I'm working 2 low-wage jobs, then how can I come to the PTA meeting? How am I going to show up at 8 o'clock in the morning to meet my child's teacher or work with them after school if I'm literally unable to be around my child for the vast majority of the day because I'm trying to keep the lights on? But then even you dig into the county, when you look at how, an important bill around, was actually failed through the county council around source of income discrimination and where they accept vouchers. So if you look at
Home Act.
Yeah. And so if you look at the east and west sides of the county, it actually almost mimics the east and west sides of Baltimore City in that those schools are not performing at the same levels that they are in Delaney or Towson. It's much different than what you see in Middle River and Randallstown. But to your original question about funding, most of the tests are computer-based. Well, if we know for a fact that internet access in Baltimore City, most people use their phones. So if my first time interacting with a laptop or a desktop computer is to take this test, and literally how to use this device, we're at a disadvantage. And when we talk about just where the world is moving, that's access to technology is critical. And when you have teachers that are having to spend their own money to buy books, it's problematic. So yeah, we do need more money, because to compete with the surrounding jurisdictions, to compete with the global society that we're in right now, our kids need more, but also they have less. So it's like, it's this debate around money, it always gets diverted to, well, how are we spending? We need audits, and we do need accountability. Like, I don't want to take the school system off the hook for how we've historically invested in the schools or not, or how we've spent money or haven't. I mean, those are real questions and real discussions that we need to have, and real transparency and accountability that needs to be improved. But at the end of the day, to say that more money isn't solving the problem, I have to completely disagree with that. If our school system had more money, I'm sure you would have another teacher assistant to help manage a classroom of 30 to 40 kids, right? Like, that makes a difference in the learning environment. Having access to laptops and iPads in the classroom makes a difference in a child's ability to learn coding. Or stay after school, right? Like, kids are always on their phone. This is where we're moving into a society that is completely based in technology, yet our school system does not have that. And so, yeah, we do need more money. We need to spend it wisely. We need to be accountable in how we spend it. But the debate is often really shifted, and it moves people in the wrong direction, because every time one of these stories comes out, I get an inundation of calls of folks saying, look, I'm coming down to the school board. We need audits. We need all, and it's like, yeah, we do need all of those things. However, our kids are fighting with one arm tied behind their back, and so I think it's how it's portrayed is very problematic.
And finally, we know that we've been focusing on Project Baltimore, but I want to get some solutions out there. We've already started this conversation about what real change could look like, what effective change would look like within the school system, within the classroom itself. I want to continue this and end on this conversation. Let's start with you and talk about some more of the things that you would like to see in your classroom and other classrooms around the city, things that'll help uplift and encourage the students that you work with and other students around the city.
The biggest thing I would like to see is an African-centered curriculum, and also the arts. A lot of times arts is seen as an extracurricular activity.
And it's cut all over the city.
Yeah, we have none at my school. We have an art teacher, and that's about it, but we don't have anything else. And the reason is because apparently we don't have enough students to be able to get those types of programs, which is, I don't even want to talk about that, because that just makes me really sad and depressed. But what I do notice is when I can bring those things into my classroom, my students flourish, and they want it, and they ask for it. And I think that leads to the second thing, which is that African-centered curriculum, which when it's brought up, and especially when it's brought up by a Black person, there's a pin drop, and there's this sense of uncomfortability, because it would be literally overhauling the entire school curriculum, because right now it's a European-based curriculum. And I know that because when I talk to my kids about themselves, they say, oh, here Ms. Brown goes with that Black talk. Ms. Brown, you always talking about Black stuff all the time. I say, because you're Black. I mean, that's what we're supposed to talk about. But they're so used to being immersed in a European society that it's uncomfortable for them now to talk about themselves. And when you have a low self-image, education is not your priority. Like, you have to love yourself first for you to want to learn more. And that's not being talked about. We talk about the whole child, but we don't want to talk about the Black child. It's like cancerous to just say it. And thirdly, I would say that we need to work from the bottom up. If we continue to have top-heavy decisions being made by people that aren't from Baltimore, haven't attended Baltimore City Public Schools, don't have kids to go to Baltimore City Public Schools, we'll continue to have decisions that don't work in the best interest of the directly impacted.
And it's interesting because your school is on McCullough Street. It was one of the original racial dividing lines of Baltimore. And so your students are really kind of in that, living that history still to this day.
Yes, literally, if not worse.
Councilman Burnett.
So I think as a policymaker, I think that's what my solution would be, is pushing for whether it's Kerwin Commission to be implemented quicker, pushing our state representatives to pass a funding formula sooner than the recommendations, or at least a stopgap that adequately funds Baltimore City schools. We're coming up on the legislative session, so I would say really pushing people to, if they can, make it to Annapolis. If not, submitting testimony and really calling their legislators on the city delegation and other delegations as well to really push the needle that we need adequate funding in Baltimore City schools. We need it right now. I'd say the other piece is to the point around just that engagement, right? How do we, and this is what we were talking about a little earlier, is how do we create an environment that allows for that bottom-up perspective to be reflected in the policy decisions that are being made at school headquarters, and more engagement, right? We were talking a little bit offline on some things that I as a council member, yeah, I'm working directly with the school CEO, so there's things that I'm hearing that are obviously not being filtered down, but also from that perspective, they're not, obviously these things are coming from the top and not really reflective of what the real needs are or what the vision is from parents and teachers who are really on the front line, who are educating our kids every day, and really pushing from the bottom up. And how do we create that environment is something that I'm still trying to think through, and how do I create these spaces, both in my district, obviously I spend a lot of time, all my time, when I'm not in City Hall, but trying to just work with our schools, right? I think there was a point raised earlier that I think is really crucial, in that, like, what schools have arts programs and out of school time programs are really, they vary school to school. If you have a principal that is very open to partnerships or can advocate for themselves and reach out and say, look, I need laptops in my school, who do you know? I get those kind of calls. But then I have some other schools where I may never hear anything from the principals at all, and those kids suffer, or they don't have those programs because the administration of that individual school isn't really trying to create that environment that is really holistic in the things that our kids need. So I think really pushing our school board to do better, pushing our individual schools to do better, trying to create those avenues and thinking through, if we're having a school choice meeting, or if we're having anything that's related to the school, when are parents able to come? Is it 8 o'clock in the morning? Is it 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Why not both, right? Trying to create this environment so that these schools are spaces that are community focused, that are community centered, open to parents to be able to come in and really just focus on having that, because we talked a little bit about, and this is a whole different thing around school closures, but the culture of the school should be reflective of the neighborhood that it's in, and the decision-making process should be made by parents, by community members who are a part of that school environment. And so I think that is something that we as policymakers, we as teachers and principals and advocates need to really focus on, is how do we take it school by school, and really push to make sure that while we have these larger issues around funding and statewide funding and federal funding and curriculum, how can we make an impact on our neighborhood school, in our community schools? So I think that's where I would like to see some of the focus.
Shane?
So I personally think that this issue is like really, really grand, like much bigger than just pushing for school funding. I think it's a multifaceted issue that needs to be attacked from a lot of different angles, which is why a policy like the youth fund is really important, because it allows the community to have a stake in the kids of the city, and it allows people to actually invest in do the things like grassroots organizing around kids, because honestly, leaving it to the school system and the administration at these schools is just absolutely ridiculous, because it's gonna fail. Not to say that they don't do their jobs or anything, but it's a really big problem here in Baltimore. Poverty is a huge issue. Like it was mentioned, it's impossible for a parent to be invested in their students' education if they have to work 2 jobs just to keep their lights on. And I think to address the issue of education in Baltimore City, we have to address a lot of other issues at the same time. And one of the most important issues that we need to address is having multiple people invested in our youth at the same time, because we can't just leave it to the school system. I think pushing for more funding is really important too, but it's important to address other issues at the same time, especially poverty, because that's one of the biggest setbacks in the education system.
Your socioeconomic background is the greatest predictor of your standardized test scores. You won't hear that on Project Baltimore or Fox News, but that is a well-established fact. And until you deal with your social background, until you address the poverty, which was created by policy, you won't hear that on Fox or Project Baltimore either. You're not going to get anywhere, like you said. So thank you for that. Lawrence.
So I'll try to be brief, but again, it's a comprehensive issue. In terms of the way I see the dynamic functioning, I'm extremely concerned because I feel that the conversation is extremely limited and problematic from my point of view. So what you'll get is the advocates, and they'll put a parade of usually young black poor faces, and they'll have like mantras, and mantras will be things like, we need AC, we need clean water in our schools, and we need iPads. And it's almost exploitative in my opinion, because you have people who are suffering acutely pushing for what really is like a modicum of just basic human rights. AC, water, and iPads is not school reform. It's basic human rights, which is good, but it's not going to get us to the point where we need to get. So I want to preface my presentation of recommendations by saying a few things your viewers may not know. For example, I come from the world of competitive policy debate. For the first 30 years of competitive college policy debate, there was one black national champion. Over the past 10 years, there have been 10 black national champions, and 6 of them are from Baltimore, all public school graduates. We had last summer, the National Poetry Slam champions were from Baltimore. I believe almost all of them Baltimore City public school graduates. And we have something like the Baltimore Algebra Project, which is youth who get paid to not just teach other youth math and have an incredible success rate, but they were also leading some of the peaceful protests around the Baltimore uprising. Why don't we talk about that? Why don't people know that? It's not just Sinclair, is my argument. It's also, unfortunately, I believe that the people who have the power in the teachers union, and particularly powerful nonprofits, didn't produce those people. So they understand that those people were produced by the black community. And the expertise of folks in the black community who weren't doing it for a grant, weren't doing it in school, but were doing it because they had an expertise about how to train young black people to be excellent. And Baltimore just has a huge problem. It does not even conceptualize that working class black folks can be experts in terms of how to teach black folks. So when I say recommendations, I'm saying look at things like African-centered curriculum, as we've already talked about. I'm just providing some more context for. Look at things like homeschooling collaboratives that have been proven to have incredible success here. But what we can't do is allow that continuous march to happen. AC, water, iPads. Because if you're getting taught that Christopher Columbus is a hero, I don't care if it's on a old piece of paper or an iPad. That's a problem.
Right.
And we need to push the discourse to include a more complex and actually nuanced understanding of what has to happen in this city where the public schools are high 80s, low 90s% black. We need a solution that actually fits the people that are experiencing these conditions.
All right, I want to thank you all for joining us on this episode of The Real Baltimore, and we're going to definitely continue this conversation. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on The Real Baltimore.